Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 292. His Last Bow Wow. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we go into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I'm kind of wowed by the title here. I don't know exactly what to make of it. This is all you're doing.
Yes, it is, and I'm unbowed or unbowed, so pick your choice.
Okay, and I will be wowed and woed. Either way, woohoo. Well, the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles292. All lowercase, that'll take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, where you can click on links and follow us on social media and add comments, sign up for email from us to notify you when new episodes are out, all stuff like that, as well as the ability to become a Patreon supporter. For just as little as $1 a month, you can help support the show and all that we do, the production efforts, the behind-the-scenes stuff that nobody really cares about, the stuff that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, because you're here for Sherlock Holmes. And hey, so are we. So if you're interested in helping to support the show, please go ahead and do that. And there are prizes involved at various levels, so check that out. We'd be delighted to have you. And, one other thing. We've been getting some wonderful submissions lately from people who are suggesting Trifles topics. Do you ever find yourself listening to our show and thinking to yourself, geez, I wish these guys would stop blathering on? Well, everybody does that. But do you ever wish we would talk about a particular thing that you came across or something you wondered about when you were reading the Sherlock Holmes stories? If that's the case, you can email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com and suggest a Trifles episode for the future. And if we end up using your topic in one of our shows, we will send you some Sherlockian merch. Some stuff from the vaults over here at Trifles. So feel free to have at it. Well, this is interesting, Bert. This is the episode in our monthly cadence, the first episode of the month, where we get into one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the theorist things, where we take apart a piece of old scholarship, something that may not have seen the light of day for quite some time, or that may be rare, and we bring it up for discussion. And in this case, you found something that I didn't know existed. Why don't you go ahead and tee it up for us?
I will. I didn't know it existed either. This is from a book. There have been several books entitled Baker Street and Beyond, but this particular volume called Baker Street and Beyond, Essays on Sherlock Holmes by Lord Donegal, was a joint effort of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and the Westminster Libraries in London in 1993. And I had never, despite my long association with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, I had never come across this book before. And one of the charming things about it is that there's an introduction here by Tony Howlett, who at the time was the president of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, about Lord Donegal, who had been the leader of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London when I first became engaged with things Sherlockian and with societies. But I knew absolutely none of the information that Tony Howlett has in here. He says, I'll just give you a quick summary of this. Lord Donegal, who was known universally to his friends as Don, was quite a Holmesian scholar. He was born in 1903. He was the 6th Marquis of Donegal. He succeeded to his title when he was less than 1 year old on the death of his 81-year-old father. He was an Irish peer with subsidiary titles that included Viscount Chichester, Earl of Donegal, Earl of Belfast, Baron Fisherwick. Educated at Eton and Oxford, he died in 1975. Tony Howlett says, not really a rich man, he was very comfortably off and could have lived a life of leisured ease, but that was not his way. His public life had begun early when, at age 7, he proposed the toast to King George V at the Council of the Empire luncheon in 1911. He entered journalism. He became a well-known columnist with a column that ran for many years in the Sunday Dispatch. He traveled extensively. He was an effortless linguist. He was a journalist who covered a very wide field. A lifelong skier, he covered winter sports in Switzerland. He was a sailor with his own yacht in the Mediterranean. He liked fast cars. He held a pilot's license. He flew his own plane. And during the Spanish Civil War, he rushed his copy back by air to his newspaper. He was a distinguished war correspondent in the Second World War. He was on the last plane out of Paris only a few hours before the Germans invaded. He was a great enthusiast for jazz music. He became a disc jockey at the BBC in 1949. He also ran a Dixieland band and jazz club in Kensington. He was also a lifelong student of Holmes. He became the first to join the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. He became editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal in 1956 until his death. He was elegant, urbane, witty, quiet, and unassuming, a scholarly bibliophile with one of the best collections of Holmesiana in Europe. And he had written these essays, which, as I say, were compiled in this book in 1993, in the early 1960s, when apparently there was an effort to revive the Strand magazine with the New Strand, which ran for 15 issues. And so all of his Baker Street and Beyond columns, because he contributed a Baker Street and Beyond column in each issue, have been brought together with a couple that continued after the demise of the New Strand, and those were covered then also in the Sherlock Holmes Journal. But this brings all of his essays together. So there you are. Isn't that remarkable?
That is fantastic. And two things. One, I should note that if you're interested in the Strand magazine in its current format, as well as in the historic collecting form, we have two interviews you might want to check out. One is with Andrew Gulley, who is the current editor and publisher of the Strand magazine. That's episode 139 of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And then we talked with Charles Prepelec, who collects bound editions of the Strand, in episode 208. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes. The second thing I ought to note is, as I looked up Lord Donegal on Wikipedia, this is Edward Chichester, the 6th Marquess of Donegal, informally titled Edward Arthur Donald St. George Hamilton Chichester, 6th Marquess of Donegal. He was born in 1903, of course, to the 5th Marquess of Donegal, who died in 1904. He was the son of the elderly George Chichester, and I thought it was interesting that they called him the elderly George Chichester, and I looked, I said, oh yeah, his father was 75 years old when he was born. So he inherited the title at 1 year of age.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was something that Tony Howlett said in his introduction, except Tony Howlett's dates were a little different. He said that Lord Donegal assumed the title when he was less than 1 year old.
Less than 1 year. There you
on
go.
the death of his 81-year-old.
81. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
I must have been snoozing.
That's what Tony Howlett thought.
I was so taken by trying to get all of this information in about the Marquess of Donegals. Looking back at their family history, just amazing that we have this within the Sherlockian movement.
Yeah.
So we have this essay here, which appears in Baker Street and Beyond, this volume that you picked up recently. And how wonderful that this has come to light. There are how many essays in it?
There are, I think 19. It also includes in the back a complete set, color reproductions and so on, of Julian Wolfe's Sherlockian Christmas cards.
Oh,
with some attended notes, and Julian, who had been the Wiggins equivalent of the Baker Street Irregulars, the commissionaire, for a very long while, had been sending out his Christmas cards, and I think he shared the format, the illustration, and so on with Lord Donegal, who then sent them out himself, I think, also to his own list.
I think he did the colorized versions. If I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Because the ones I have of Julian, at least from the Sherlockian Atlas, are all black and white. And I think it was Lord Donegal's or the Sherlock Holmes Society of London's doing that made them wonderful pastels.
Yeah, so this has a number of plates, color plates.
Yeah,
in the back.
that's great, and that might be a topic for future discussion if we think about Sherlockian geography in future Trifles episodes. So,
very good idea
to think about there. Yeah. But why don't we hustle on before people get bored out of their skulls here, and talk about what it is that Lord Donegal was talking about in this particular essay from Baker Street and Beyond, right after this word.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today.
Okay, we're back. Bert, do you want to set us off in the right direction here?
Yes, the purpose, I think, of the essays that Lord Donegal contributed to this new strand, the publication, was to ensure that there was always in an issue of the Strand magazine, new or old, something referring to Sherlock Holmes. And so one of the many nice things about this essay is that he's talking to a general public audience. And so he starts with a lot of engaging things and questions to draw people in. Now, this is the 10th one of his Baker Street and Beyond essays called His Last Bow. And he starts by saying, is it bow, B-O-U-G-H, as in, when the bow breaks, or is it bow, as in peep? Is it supposed to be his last bow or his last bow? Then he goes on and he says, who wrote it? Who or what is the dangling Prussian? Is this the first mention of a Model T in English literature? Has any collector seen von Bork's copy of A Practical Handbook of Bee Culture? what's going on here? Was this nihilist mentioned, Klopman, none other than Peter the Painter of the Sydney Street Battle when Winston Churchill was Home Secretary? And that's just sort of the random set of observations he makes when he starts.
That's great, and he frames it with a little set of couplets here about Holmes's war service. Of course, his last bow takes place on the cusp of the Great War, World War I, and Donegal shares this strain with us. Thus ended in glory the master's great story, in saving of honor the crowns. May life be ecstatic and never rheumatic, with Holmes mid his bees on the downs. I like that.
Yeah, and he goes on to say, unfortunately, I can't give any credit to the author of these immortal lines because I found them in an old scrapbook and I don't have the remotest idea of who wrote them.
Well, sometimes these things just stick with you. And acknowledging his love of aircraft and his ability to fly off into the sunset, he talks about kind of understanding the need to get up and going. He says, who cares about the methods when he's talking about Holmes making his way to Chicago and Buffalo and growing the goatee and coming up with the right accent and all, and how they planned this 2 years in advance, knowing that von Bork would be there. He says, well, provided the thing pays off, who cares about the methods? I mean, I once undertook to fly a passenger from Brussels to London, and he expressed surprise when he recognized Le Bourget in Paris. But there was method in my madness. An expert had worked out the compass courses, London, Paris, and Paris, Brussels. But if I'd worked out London, Brussels, the chap might have easily ended up in Copenhagen. So, point A to point B to point C. So there's a method in kind of putting these together, as Holmes would have figured out his path to defeating von Bork.
Yes, and then he's moved on to a sort of a central issue around his last bow. He says, scholars have long debated the authorship of his last bow because they can't argue the date, since it's obviously August of 1914. And he says, now I'll come back to that, he says, but let's think for a moment about the first-rate English prose that's written here in his last bow. Remember that scene, Holmes and Watson, having got von Bork irrevocably trussed up, they stroll out to that terrace at Harwich, looking out towards the seat of the trouble. Stand with me here upon the terrace, says Holmes, for it may be the last quiet talk we shall ever have. There's an east wind coming, such a wind as never blew on England yet, and it will be cold and bitter, Watson, and a good many of us may wither before its blast. But it's God's own wind none the less, and a cleaner, better, stronger land. Well, he says, before you forget the rhythm of the style, try this. It is always a joy to meet an American, for I am one of those who believe that the folly of a monarch and the blundering of a minister in far gone years will not prevent our children from being someday citizens of the same worldwide country under a flag which shall be the quartering of the Union Jack with the stars and stripes. Now, he says, so in each case here, it's Sherlock Holmes talking. But in all my 25 years in Fleet Street, I never knew two reporters to write up a conversation in exactly the same style. Each can be perfectly faithful, and yet they are each as different as black and white. The point is that nobody has ever questioned Dr. Watson's authorship of The Noble Bachelor. And I make so bold as to say that you only have to compare these two passages to know that if Dr. Watson wrote one, he wrote the other.
Yeah. So, and then he goes further about the authorship. He says, if Mycroft Holmes occasionally was the British government, the late Edgar W. Smith was nearly always the Baker Street Irregulars. And Edgar went flat out in 1946 to proclaim Mycroft Holmes the author of His Last Bow. And he said few people dared raise a dissenting voice. And H.W. Bell, one of the earliest researchers, had long held that His Last Bow and the Mazarin Stone were from the same pen. I don't agree with him, writes Donegal, but the point is that Edgar W. Smith never contended that the Mazarin Stone was written by Mycroft Holmes. Therefore, Bell had the temerity to flout Smith's dictum. And then it goes on to say that Cornelius Helling, the head of the Dutch Sherlock Holmes Society, poured cold water on a theory advanced by Sir Sidney Roberts that His Last Bow and Mazarin Stone were written by one of the wives of Watson. Oh, goodness.
Yes, and he pointed out a passage in The Problem of Thor Bridge where Watson writes, "In some cases I played so small a part that they could only be told as by a third person." And Lord Donegal says, well, Watson's role in His Last Bow is small only in comparison to that of Holmes. But after all, the doctor was a very modest man. And, the subtlety of English, as by a third person. It says a mouthful, at least to me, he says.
And he concludes by saying, I disagree with all of them. Convinced as I am that Watson wrote His Last Bow, I'm equally as sure that he did not write the Mazarin Stone. It's so badly written that I would think that Billy the Page, if he happened to be around at the time, is probably our culprit.
Yeah, that's a new one. I like that. Well, and then he's on to this question of pronunciation, which I have never encountered in all my years of reading Sherlock Holmes and talking about it. Never encountered it, which is, how do you pronounce the title? Is it His Last Bow, as in When the Bow Breaks, or is it in His Last Bow, as in My Violin Bow?
Yeah. Keeping aside the idea that we have a society of Sherlock Holmes bow tie wearers that we call the Last Bow, I've never heard it pronounced any other way myself, with one exception. Somebody did an internal sketch, and it may have been Julian Wolfe, as we were talking about the atlases earlier. He did an internal sketch of Baker Street, and in the Mazarin Stone, you'll recall that there was a bow window there where the Sherlock Holmes mannequin sat, and Julian labeled the window His Last Bow window. So that's the only time I've heard it used like that. But Nathan Bengis came up with an argument for bow, saying that, for bow, His Last Bow, saying that Holmes was taking a farewell bow to an audience, which makes sense. And I would think that would have been Conan Doyle's intention, as this was a retirement case of Sherlock Holmes.
And then, interestingly enough, Donegal has something here also that I've never heard of. He says, Monsieur Gilles, see, in the Dutch would say Gillis, but it's Gilles, I guess, Vautier, who translated all the stories contained in His Last Bow for a recent edition by Robert Laffont in Paris, translated the whole of the Holmes saga in 12 volumes, and has obviously come across some evidence as yet undiscovered by other scholars. Monsieur Vautier seems to be in no doubt whatever. To him, it's bow. And that's the end of it, because he entitles the whole series of cases, including the Von Bork drama, as son dernier coup d'archet. It's coup d'archet is a violin, has to do with the movement of a violin. It's a stroke. It's a violin. It's a way of moving the bow across the strings of the violin. Coup d'archet. No shilly-shallying there. And he says, I've written to Monsieur Vautier, but the time has elapsed. Not enough time has elapsed since my letter, so I don't have a reply yet.
And he says, this student has only one comment to make on this vexed subject. Does his last bow make any sense in English? His last quiver or his last arrow? Yes. And if there is one thing that the much maligned Dr. John H. Watson never did, it was to write English that did not make sense. So, pending a reply from Monsieur Vautier, this commentary reserves final judgment.
And then each one of these essays he concludes with a little collector's corner, which is fun to read some of the others. Apparently in the 1960s, £100 would have gotten you a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual in England. But he says, and he discusses the fact that the collections of bound issues of the Strand magazine have become more difficult to come by. He says, I've never managed to pick up volume 54, and I'm still in the market for it to complete my set.
We'll have to go back and query Charles Prepelec about that to see what his last collection of Strand magazines looks like. And that, I'm sure, is anything but a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.